They're everywhere. You'll have thigh bones stacked up in places. You'll have skulls stacked in other places. It's almost like a warehouse of human bones.
Beneath Rome's streets, archaeologists forced open a chamber that no one had entered for centuries. They expected bones and faded inscriptions. Instead, the atmosphere turned grim the moment the seal cracked. The air inside was stale, heavy, and carried the scent of something unnatural. The team froze as their lights revealed objects no burial should contain. Even the most experienced among them hesitated. Their tools trembled as they realized this was no ordinary tomb. What waited inside was not history preserved. It was something far more disturbing. The sealed chamber beneath Rome. The discovery began during what should have been a routine restoration of one of Rome's lesser-known catacombs. Archaeologists were reinforcing a section of tunnel that had partially collapsed when they noticed something unusual behind the rubble. Clearing away the debris revealed not just another wall of stone, but a doorway. What made it immediately alarming was that this door was sealed far more securely than anything they had ever encountered underground. The doorway was triple sealed, with mortar layers pressed tightly into every seam. Deep scratches showed where ancient tools had been used to hammer the blocks into place. Across the surface, faint Latin inscriptions could still be made out. The words translated into a blunt warning: "Do not disturb." For a team used to dealing with burial chambers and faded epitaphs, the message felt unnerving. This was not a respectful dedication to the dead. It was a command to stay away. The team quickly realized the scale of what they were facing. The slab of stone was unusually thick, reinforced with multiple layers, as though it had been designed to resist not just time, but deliberate attempts to break in. The sheer effort it would have taken to build it raised questions about why anyone would go to such lengths. The catacombs already contained thousands of tombs, yet none were guarded like this. As preparations were made to open the chamber, the atmosphere in the tunnels shifted. Dust clung to the air, and every sound echoed against the walls, in a way that made even small movements feel amplified. The archaeologists wore protective suits in case of contamination from trapped air or ancient disease. Cameras recorded each moment, but those present later described a tension that no footage could truly capture. When the first cracks appeared along the mortar lines, the air grew heavier. A stale odor pushed through the opening, and several workers later admitted they felt a wave of unease, as if something long forgotten was suddenly stirring again. As they widened the gap, faint markings became visible inside. The walls carried etched symbols that no one immediately recognized. They appeared rushed, carved into the stone before the chamber was sealed. Their meaning was lost, but the presence of symbols suggested urgency. Every scrape of stone and every groan of metal tools added to the dread. The deeper the team went, the more obvious it became that this chamber had not been sealed by accident. It was built to last, to resist intrusion at any cost. And that raised the question that would drive the entire investigation. What was so important, or so dangerous, that it had to be locked away beneath Rome for centuries? To understand why this discovery is so significant, we need to step back to the origins of the catacombs themselves, and why the Romans chose to create such vast underground worlds in the first place. Why Rome went underground, the birth of the catacombs. The story of Rome's catacombs begins with a simple problem. The city was running out of room for its dead. By the late 2nd century AD, Rome was bursting with people, and burial plots above ground had become expensive luxuries reserved for the wealthy. Ordinary citizens, Jews, and early Christians had to find another way. On the city's outskirts, they discovered an answer beneath their feet. The volcanic stone called tufa was soft enough to carve, yet strong enough to last for centuries. Into this rock, they dug mile after mile of passageways, creating entire underground cemeteries unlike anything the world had seen before. The move underground was not only about space. Romans believed the dead carried a spiritual pollution known as miasma. For that reason, burials were forbidden inside city walls, forcing families to seek alternatives. For Christians in particular, these tunnels became sacred places where burial was tied to their belief in resurrection. To them, the catacombs were not just cold corridors. They were the first soil of hope, where the dead rested while awaiting eternal life. The tunnels also served a practical but dangerous purpose. When Christianity was banned and persecution swept through the city, worshippers met in secret beneath the ground. In the flickering light of oil lamps, they whispered prayers, performed communion rituals, and even carried out baptisms. The authorities saw only silence on the streets above, but deep below the empire's foundations, Christianity was growing. Over time, this hidden world expanded into something immense. Archaeologists estimate that Rome's catacombs stretch for more than 300 miles and contain hundreds of thousands of burials. They became a true city of the dead, with corridors stacked wall to wall like shelves in a library. The size alone shows that these catacombs were not temporary solutions, but entire underground communities that supported both spiritual practice and memory. Ancient records prove how powerful these places were. Church fathers like Saint Jerome wrote of kneeling in prayer among skeletons, surrounded by paintings of Christ as the Good Shepherd. The walls spoke of sorrow and devotion at the same time. Imagine a grieving mother rushing down a stairwell with her child's ashes, whispering her last prayer before sealing the urn into stone. Scenes like this happened thousands of times, leaving marks that remain in the tunnels today. Some archaeologists believe secrecy itself carried spiritual weight. According to this view, the underground protected both the bodies of the dead and the faith of the living, shielding them from forces that wanted to erase them. Whatever the motive, what began as a necessity became something far larger. Life in the world of death, underground communities. The catacombs were not empty tunnels. Archaeologists and historians describe them as spaces where people carried out daily rituals, visited graves, and maintained their communities while surrounded by the dead. People did not only come here to bury their dead, they returned to remember them, to gather as families, and to keep traditions alive when the world above felt hostile or unsafe. These narrow tunnels became an extension of daily life, even if they were surrounded by the dead. Murals painted onto the walls give us the clearest evidence of this. In some chambers, entire biblical scenes stretch across the stone. Jonah is shown being swallowed by a whale, a story of despair turning into deliverance. The figure of the Good Shepherd appears repeatedly, a comforting symbol of care and protection. These images were not decoration alone. They were teaching tools and reminders for communities that could not practice their faith openly above ground. To children growing up around these walls, the paintings may have been their first lessons in Scripture. Pagans also left their mark. Some tombs contained oil lamps, carved jewelry, and ceramic jars filled with food or wine. These were offerings meant to accompany the dead into the afterlife, evidence of beliefs that life continued beyond the grave. Archaeologists have even found traces of wine residue sealed into jars for nearly 2,000 years, as though the last mourners had just walked away. It shows that the catacombs were not simply Christian sanctuaries, but shared spaces where different groups brought their own customs underground. The atmosphere of this hidden world must have been unforgettable. According to accounts, hymns echoed in the dark during communal gatherings. Families sometimes shared bread and wine in what were known as memorial meals. Children could be heard laughing or running through the passages, while parents whispered prayers nearby. The dead were never far away, yet the living carved out moments of normalcy among them. It was a fragile coexistence, one that blurred the line between the two worlds. Archaeologists had long assumed the catacombs were simply places where families buried their dead and worshipped in relative safety. As they explored further, they began encountering elements that did not fit with ordinary burial sites. The tunnels felt colder, heavier, and charged with an unease that was hard to explain. It became clear that the catacombs had witnessed far more than quiet mourning or whispered prayers. Something hidden, disturbing, and deliberately concealed had taken place in these underground corridors. Strange finds in the catacombs. The deeper the archaeologists went, the more unsettling the discoveries became. Behind one collapsed section, sealed niches began to emerge. At first, they thought they were looking at simple extensions of tomb space, but the contents made them pause. The team fell silent, exchanging quick, uneasy glances. Whispers broke out among them. This did not look like anything they had seen in previous digs. The bones were the first shock. Mixed in with human burials were animal remains that did not belong. Some carried deliberate cut marks. Others showed scorching as if they had been burned in controlled fires. Ostrich fragments, bird bones from foreign regions, and specific parts of carcasses suggested ritual selection rather than scraps of food. One researcher muttered in disbelief that these could be offerings. Another insisted it had to be contamination from later centuries. No one spoke loudly, as if raising their voice in that cramped chamber would make the strange evidence more real. Then came the jars and lamps. Archaeologists reported that chemical residue testing revealed traces of wine, resins, and even compounds that could have been linked to intoxicating plants. More disturbing were the lamps. Many had been left standing, still blackened with soot, their flames snuffed out halfway through burning. To the team, it looked as if ceremonies had been abandoned suddenly, people fleeing in haste and never returning. The site left several visibly shaken. One researcher admitted later that they felt like intruders who had stumbled into a ritual that had been cut short for reasons no one wanted to name. What truly unsettled the group were the engravings on the walls. Strange symbols appeared in clusters, interlocking circles, distorted hybrid figures, and six-pointed stars, unlike any known Christian or pagan designs. Infrared scanning showed faint outlines beneath later layers of plaster, as if someone had deliberately tried to cover them up. When the light revealed them clearly, a few team members stood frozen, staring at the wall. One whispered that these were not burial marks, but something else entirely. The shock was visible on their faces. They had studied catacombs for years, yet this was new and disturbing. The burials themselves made everything worse. Stacked bodies, packed tightly in ways that suggested haste, hinted at plague pits. In one chamber, the sight was so grim that a few of the archaeologists backed out, shaking their heads in disbelief. Reports suggested that tests may have even identified traces of pathogens, though nothing was confirmed. Still, the idea alone was enough to spread quiet unease. At every turn, the atmosphere grew heavier. The carvings, the stacked bodies, the interrupted rituals, it all pointed to something hidden deliberately. Some on the team began speculating nervously that this was not just a place of burials, but a site of forbidden ceremonies or desperate measures in the face of disease. The discoveries felt like fragments of a darker truth, hinting that the underground may have seen rituals that no one was ever meant to uncover. Others dismissed it as misinterpretation, and this was only the beginning. Deeper within Rome's catacombs, stranger and more terrifying secrets awaited. Blood and shadows, the secret cults of Rome. When archaeologists examined the strange finds deeper in the catacombs, the pieces began to connect into a picture far darker than a simple burial site. What they had uncovered did not just look like hasty graves or forgotten niches. The animal bones, the jars of residue, the lamps abandoned mid-burning, the strange engravings, and the stacked bodies all pointed to rituals that did not belong in a Christian or pagan cemetery. The deeper the team studied, the more one possibility began to dominate. These tunnels had not only been places of burial, they had also been used as gathering spaces for some of Rome's most secretive and unsettling cults. The bones were the first clue. Ostrich fragments, bird bones from foreign regions, and carcass parts burned or cut in deliberate ways suggested ritual use, not contamination or random mixing. Such remains lined up with known sacrificial practices, where specific animals carried symbolic weight. The fact that these bones appeared mixed with human burials made the setting even stranger. It meant ceremonies had been performed where the dead already rested, as if the living had sought to mingle offerings with the human remains below. This was not typical Roman practice. It fit better with cult rituals that often operated on the margins of society, where secrecy and symbolism were more important than order. The jars and lamps told another part of the story. Residue analysis revealed traces of wine, resins, and possibly intoxicating plants. These were not casual storage jars. They were ritual vessels, meant to carry substances that altered the senses or played roles in ceremonies of death and rebirth. The lamps, many of which were discovered still blackened with soot and extinguished halfway through burning, painted an even more chilling picture. They suggested that ceremonies had been interrupted suddenly. For reasons no one could confirm, the flames had been left to die, leaving behind the eerie impression of people who fled mid-ritual and never returned. This sense of interruption raised the question of whether suppression, disaster, or fear had forced them to abandon the underground chamber. The engravings deepened the unease. Interlocking circles, distorted hybrid figures, and six-pointed star-like shapes appeared on walls that had later been plastered over. When infrared scanning revealed faint outlines beneath these plaster layers, it became clear that someone had deliberately tried to hide them. These were not decorative flourishes or Christian symbols. They were unique and disturbing, lining up with the iconography of certain cults that Roman officials had long tried to ban. Their concealment suggested that later generations had seen them as dangerous or shameful, something not meant to survive into the open record. The stacked bodies brought the horror to its peak. Packed tightly together in cramped chambers, they looked less like planned burials and more like plague pits or hurried disposals. Some tests hinted at traces of pathogens, though nothing was ever fully confirmed. What unsettled researchers most was the way the bodies appeared in spaces that also held ritual evidence. This was not the typical separation of sacred ceremony and burial ground. It was a blending of the two, pointing to a desperate attempt to fuse death with ritual meaning. For some experts, it looked like the work of cults who had tried to sanctify disaster, turning plague or mass death into part of their underground ceremonies. Among the cults suspected, 3 stood out. The cult of Mithras was feared for its secrecy and its demands on Roman soldiers. Every Mithraic gathering centered on the image of Mithras, slaying the sacred bull, whose blood symbolized renewal. Animal remains and blood traces in the chamber connected easily to this symbolism. Ancient accounts described new initiates splattered with blood as a form of purification, a practice that matched the scorched and cut bones the archaeologists had found. Performed in low stone chambers with lamps and drums, these rites fit eerily well with what the catacomb evidence suggested. The cult of Isis, imported from Egypt, also offered explanations. Wine and resins, connected with ceremonies of grief and resurrection. Isis was worshipped as the goddess who reassembled her murdered husband Osiris, promising life after death. Her cult spread rapidly among slaves, women, and the poor, groups who found solace in her rituals. Incense-filled chambers and torchlit processions described in Roman accounts could easily explain the jars and lamps left behind in the sealed niches. To Roman authorities, this cult was dangerous because it gave the powerless hope and unity. To those below ground, it was salvation in a world filled with loss. The cult of Cybele, the Great Mother, was perhaps the most disturbing. Her rites were known for frenzy, bloodletting, and ecstatic dancing to the pounding of drums. Followers slashed themselves as offerings, and some priests even castrated themselves to prove devotion. The chaotic engravings on the walls, with distorted hybrid figures and overwhelming symbols, resembled the frenzied atmosphere described in Cybele's worship. The tightly packed bodies may have even reflected mass rites gone wrong, or attempts to sanctify death through chaotic ritual. For Roman authorities, such worship bordered on madness, and the underground setting would have only amplified the terrifying energy. The suppression of these cults explained the cover-ups. Officials feared Mithraic loyalty among soldiers who placed the god above the emperor. They worried about the spread of Isis worship, which threatened Roman order by giving the marginalized a powerful spiritual identity. Cybele's frenzied blood sacrifices shocked even hardened Romans. If one of these groups had practiced rites in the catacombs that went too far, it would have been logical for later authorities or communities to seal off the chambers, plaster over the engravings, and erase the evidence as best they could. By the time archaeologists uncovered these chambers, what they found looked less like a burial space and more like the fossilized remains of forbidden worship. The bones, jars, lamps, engravings, and bodies were not random fragments. Together they told the story of rituals abandoned in fear, ceremonies carried out in secrecy, and a cover-up that sought to bury Rome's shadows deep underground. Cache of faiths, martyrs and persecutors in the underground. Beneath Rome, the catacombs may have been more than burial corridors. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence suggesting that certain chambers were used to punish early Christians who refused to renounce their faith. Skeletal remains in some areas show signs of trauma consistent with crucifixion, blunt force, and burns, pointing to violent deaths. Some bones appear deliberately arranged or confined to niches, which experts speculate may have served as warnings or markers of execution. According to unverified reports, a few skulls display cuts and fractures that could indicate torture or restraint during interrogation. Inscriptions etched into the walls further suggest persecution. Some messages, partially eroded, seem to caution intruders, hinting at hidden deaths or secret burials. Archaeologists report that certain chambers bear combinations of Christian symbols alongside cryptic warnings. Historians speculate these inscriptions could indicate the catacombs were used not only for burial, but also to record acts of martyrdom in a way that remained invisible to the wider world. Artifacts reinforce this theory. Narrow passages, blocked doorways, fragments of iron restraints, chains, and small metallic tools suggest mechanisms for detaining captives. According to locals, oral histories recall sudden disappearances near catacomb entrances, which some researchers connect to these sealed chambers. The clustering of skeletal remains in confined spaces, combined with signs of rapid interment, points to abrupt deaths rather than natural causes. Some researchers propose that these deaths may have been ordered by emperors such as Nero or Decius, though direct proof remains elusive. But not every chamber was shared. Some were sealed off completely, holding secrets Rome itself wanted buried. The combination of trauma, cryptic inscriptions, and restrictive architecture in these spaces suggests a deliberate effort to hide the violent treatment of dissenters. Some historians believe that what remains undiscovered could reveal the full extent of persecution in the underground networks. And when investigators broke into one such sealed chamber, what they found stunned even the experts. The evidence hinted at cruelty, secrecy, and control that went far beyond ordinary burial practices. It forced researchers to consider the catacombs not just as resting places for the dead, but as hidden archives of oppression, containing layers of history that Rome tried to erase. The moment the last stone was lifted, the archaeologists froze. The chamber behind the wall had remained untouched for centuries, and the air that rushed out was thick with a stench of smoke, decay, and something indescribable that immediately made several team members gag. One researcher pressed a hand to his mouth, while another instinctively took a step back, eyes wide, as if the room itself might reach for them. The silence was oppressive, broken only by shallow, nervous breaths and the scrape of boots on stone. Dozens of skeletons filled the room. Many were children, their tiny bones stacked in cruelly confined spaces, or pressed to walls in haphazard piles. Some skulls bore deep fractures, and several long bones had marks that suggested sharp trauma. According to some reports, one archaeologist sank to the floor, trembling, muttering that they could not believe such horror had been hidden here for so long. Others stared silently, unable to look away, faces pale, as if the weight of centuries-old suffering had physically hit them. The walls were covered with frescoes that made stomachs churn. Distorted figures performed rituals that mixed Christian symbols with pagan imagery. Crosses appeared beside blood-soaked animals, and some painted faces seemed frozen in silent screams. Infrared scans revealed hidden layers beneath plaster, suggesting that earlier generations attempted to conceal or erase these images. One researcher reportedly slammed a notebook shut, whispering that the images were too much to process. The room felt alive with the echoes of terror, as if the fear of those long dead had seeped into the stones themselves. Scattered among the bones were vessels containing strange residues. Early analysis indicated traces of wine, animal fats, and unknown compounds. Some researchers recoiled as they handled the jars, fearing contamination or a lingering curse of some kind. According to reports, one team member dropped a vessel and froze in panic, unable to continue. Others silently debated whether the substances were linked to ritual meals, a plague, or something far worse. Soot blackened parts of the chamber, and charred remains suggested that flames had consumed objects, or even people before the chamber was sealed. The smell of burned oil clung to hair and clothing, making some archaeologists gag repeatedly. One reported that the oppressive air made her chest tighten and stomach churn, while another felt a creeping sense of panic, whispering to a colleague that the place was alive with what had happened here. Speculations ran rampant. Some believe the chamber was a cult ritual gone horrifyingly wrong. Others suggest it may have been a sealed plague chamber, intended to protect the city at the cost of human life. Local legends speak of disappearances and warnings about these tunnels, though nothing official confirms this. Each new theory carried an equally terrifying possibility, that Rome's underground still held scenes of suffering and terror deliberately hidden. By the time documentation began, the team was visibly shaken. Faces were ashen, hands trembled, and several had to leave the chamber briefly to regain composure. Disgust, disbelief, and fear hung thick in the air, almost tangible. The presence of children, the mix of religious symbols, the evidence of trauma, and the charred remains created an overwhelming sense that something monstrous had occurred here. Whatever the truth, this chamber preserved a dark fragment of history that demanded attention. It is more than a burial site. It is a record of cruelty, secrecy, and human terror, locked away beneath Rome for centuries. But whatever the truth, this discovery forces us to confront an unsettling legacy that even the most hardened archaeologists were unprepared to face. Echoes of Darkness, Legacy of the Sealed Chamber. The sealed chamber continues to challenge every assumption about Rome's catacombs. Modern technology has revealed details that even the earliest explorers could not have imagined. High-resolution 3D scanning shows fractures in walls that were deliberately reinforced, suggesting that whoever built the chamber wanted it to withstand not just time, but human interference. Chemical residue analysis from vessels and lamps continues to uncover substances that defy easy explanation. Some researchers report traces of compounds that could have been used in rituals or for disease control, though nothing is confirmed. Each new finding intensifies the sense that this was not an ordinary burial space. The mixture of Christian and pagan symbols inside the chamber shows how desperation and fear shaped belief. When survival or secrecy was at stake, strict religious boundaries blurred. Frescoes depicting crosses next to ritualistic animal scenes, or inscriptions mixing prayers with cryptic warnings, hint that the people who used this chamber were navigating extreme circumstances. This fusion appears to have been both spiritual and practical, a way to protect lives or hide forbidden practices from the authorities. The evidence of mass death is perhaps the most unsettling aspect. Skeletons stacked in confined spaces, marks of trauma on bones, and signs of fire or smoke suggest that fear dictated every action. Researchers report that seeing children among the remains left many team members shaken. One archaeologist admitted that documenting the chamber felt like invading a space of unimaginable terror. According to unverified reports, locals have long whispered about disappearances near the catacombs, and this discovery makes those stories chillingly plausible. Beyond this single chamber, the tunnels that remain unexplored hint that other hidden spaces may still exist beneath Rome. Sealed passages and partially collapsed niches suggest that further discoveries could reveal more about how fear, faith, and secrecy shaped life and death underground. Each new find has the potential to deepen the sense of unease already present in the catacombs. The sealed chamber is more than an archaeological find. It is a warning from the past. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human behavior under pressure and the extremes of belief. The Roman catacombs are not just graves. They are reminders that sometimes the ancients sealed their dead not only to honor them, but to protect the living, preserving layers of history that are as terrifying as they are instructive.